Letters written during a long, quiet winter night. The snow had been falling since early afternoon, and now, as the evening deepened into night, the world outside the window had become a place of soft, white silence. Each flake drifted down without hurry, joining the others that had already settled on the windowsill, on the bare branches of the oak tree in the garden, and on the stone path that led from the house to the old gate at the edge of the property. The snow made no sound as it fell, and the night itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for nothing in particular, simply existing in its own quiet way. Inside, the room was warm. A single lamp stood on the heavy oak desk, its amber light spilling gently across the surface of the wood, illuminating the stack of cream-colored parchment that rested there, waiting. The lamp had a brass base that had grown smooth with years of use, and its light was steady and soft, not bright enough to disturb the peaceful dimness of the room, but enough to see by, enough to write by. The glow reached just far enough to touch the edges of the room, leaving the corners in a comfortable shadow that felt like part of the furniture itself. A fire burned low in the hearth across from the desk, its flames moving in a slow, rhythmic dance that required no attention, no tending. The wood had been carefully chosen earlier in the day, pieces of dried cedar that released a faint, pleasant scent as they burned, a smell that mixed with the warmth of the room and became part of the air itself. The fire made small sounds from time to time, a soft settling of embers, a quiet breath of heat rising up the chimney, but these sounds were so gentle that they barely registered, becoming instead a kind of background music to the stillness. Against the far wall, a grandfather clock stood in its place, as it had for many years. Its face was pale in the low light, the hands moving with a patience that matched the night outside. The clock ticked with a steady, dependable rhythm, each sound marking the passage of time in a way that felt comforting rather than urgent. There was no rush in that ticking, no sense that time was running out or that anything needed to be accomplished before the night was through. The clock simply counted the moments, one after another, and the sound became a kind of companion to the quiet work that was about to begin. The narrator sat at the desk, settling into the familiar chair with its worn cushion and solid frame. The chair had been set in many times before, and it seemed to know the shape of the person who sat there now, offering a quiet support that required no adjustment, no thought. The desk was clear except for the lamp, the parchment, and a fountain pen that lay beside the paper, its dark green body catching a little of the lamplight. The pen was not new, but it was well cared for, and the nib was smooth and ready. Outside, the snow continued to fall. The window was not far from the desk, and through it the night was visible in shades of silver and deep blue, the snow creating a soft glow even in the darkness. There were no street lights here, no distant sounds of traffic or voices. The house stood alone in its small clearing, surrounded by trees and fields that stretched away into the winter night. It was the kind of solitude that felt safe, a solitude that wrapped around the house like a blanket, keeping the world at a comfortable distance. The narrator reached for the pen, feeling the slight weight of it in hand, the cool smoothness of its surface. There was something satisfying about the simple act of picking up a pen, of preparing to write. It was a small ritual, one that had been repeated many times before, and there was comfort in the familiarity of it. The pen was uncapped slowly, the small sound it made as the cap came free, barely audible, over the ticking of the clock and the soft murmur of the fire. The first sheet of parchment was drawn closer, positioned just so beneath the circle of lamplight. The paper had a slight texture to it, a quality that made it pleasant to touch, and it seemed to wait patiently for the words that would soon appear on its surface. There was no hurry. The night was long, and there was time for everything that needed to be done. The snow would continue to fall outside, the fire would continue to burn, and the clock would continue its steady counting. All of this would happen whether words were written or not, and that knowledge brought a sense of peace. The pen touched the paper, and the nib began to glide across the surface, leaving behind a trail of dark ink that formed letters, then words, then sentences. The sound of the pen moving across the paper was soft but distinct, a gentle scratching that joined the other quiet sounds of the room. It was a sound that spoke of concentration without strain, of activity without urgency. Each stroke of the pen was deliberate but unhurried, and the words formed themselves in a steady, flowing script that moved across the page like a slow stream moving through a meadow. The letter began as letters often do, with a simple greeting, an acknowledgment of the person who would eventually read these words. The recipient was someone known, someone whose presence was comfortable and familiar, though they were not here now. They were somewhere else, perhaps in another house, perhaps in another town, but they would receive this letter in time, and they would read it in their own quiet moment, and that was enough. There was no urgency in the sending, no need for an immediate response. The letter itself was the thing, the act of writing it, the act of forming thoughts into words and placing them carefully on the page. The narrator wrote about the snow, describing the way it had been falling since afternoon, the way it had transformed the familiar landscape into something softer, something quieter. The words flowed easily, without effort, as though they had been waiting all along to be written. There was a rhythm to the writing, a gentle back and forth as the hand moved across the page, paused at the end of a line, and then began again on the next. The fountain pen required no pressure, only a light touch, and the ink flowed smoothly from the nib, never faltering, never skipping. Outside, a branch moved slightly under the weight of accumulated snow, and a small cascade of white powder fell softly to the ground below. The movement was barely visible in the darkness, just a subtle shift in the shapes beyond the window. The narrator glanced up for a moment, watching the snow continue its descent, and then returned to the letter, adding a sentence about the way the trees looked in winter, bare and patient, waiting for spring without any sense of impatience. The fire settled again, sending up a small spiral of sparks that disappeared quickly into the darkness of the chimney. The cedar logs glowed with a deep orange light, and the heat they gave off was steady and reliable, filling the room with a warmth that felt as much a part of the space as the walls themselves. The narrator could feel that warmth on one side, a gentle presence that balanced the coolness of the air near the window. It was a pleasant contrast, not uncomfortable, just another aspect of the room's quiet harmony. The letter continued, moving from one thought to another with the ease of water finding its path downhill. The narrator wrote about small things, simple observations that required no analysis or explanation. There was a mention of the clock, its steady ticking, the way it marked time without demanding attention. There was a description of the lamp, the circle of light it cast, the way it made the rest of the room feel softer by comparison. These were not profound observations, but they were honest ones, and they filled the page with a sense of the present moment, with the actual experience of sitting here, in this room, on this particular winter night. The first letter was completed after a time, though exactly how much time had passed was difficult to say. The clock had ticked through its steady count, but the narrator had not been watching it, had not been measuring the minutes. The letter simply reached its natural end, a closing that was as gentle as its beginning, a few words of warmth and well-wishing, and then a signature. The pen was lifted from the page, and for a moment the narrator simply looked at what had been written, reading through it once more with a quiet satisfaction. The letter was set aside to dry, placed carefully at the edge of the desk where it would not be disturbed. The ink would need a few moments to set completely, and there was no rush to fold it or place it in an envelope. That could be done later, when all the letters were finished. For now there was another sheet of parchment waiting, another letter to be written, another recipient to address. The second letter began in much the same way as the first, with a greeting, with an acknowledgment. This recipient was different, someone else from the narrator's life, someone who would appreciate receiving a letter on a winter night, who would understand the gesture of taking time to sit and write by hand rather than sending a quick message by some faster, more modern means. There was something about the physical act of writing that felt important, that felt worth doing, even though it took longer, even though it required more effort. The pen moved across the page again, and the words appeared, one after another, building into sentences, into paragraphs. This letter spoke of memories of shared moments from earlier times. The narrator wrote about a walk taken together in autumn, the way the leaves had fallen around them as they moved through the woods, the particular quality of the light on that afternoon. The memory was clear but not overwhelming, present but not demanding. It was simply there, a part of the past that could be revisited gently without any need to make it more than it was. The words captured the essence of it, the feeling of companionship, the pleasure of moving through the natural world without any particular destination in mind. The snow outside continued its steady fall, and the layer on the window-sill grew deeper, though still not deep enough to obscure the view. The night was darker now, the last traces of evening having faded completely into full night. The world beyond the window was a study in subtle shades, the white of the snow, the dark lines of the tree branches, the deep blue-black of the sky above. There were no stars visible, the clouds too thick, but this did not feel like a loss. The night was complete as it was, whole and entire, requiring nothing more. The second letter progressed, moving from memory into the present, into a description of this current winter, this current night. The narrator wrote about the decision to sit down and write letters, about the appeal of the quiet task, the way it seemed to fit the mood of the season and the hour. There was no need to explain why this felt right, no need to justify the choice. It simply was what it was, an activity that brought its own quiet pleasure, its own sense of purpose. The pen moved steadily, the nib gliding across the textured surface of the parchment. The fountain pen had been a gift, received some years ago, and it had become a favorite, the kind of object that felt good to use, that brought a small satisfaction every time it was picked up. The ink inside was a deep blue-black, and it flowed consistently, never too wet, never too dry. These were the small details that made the act of writing pleasant. that transformed it from a mere task into something more, something worth doing for its own sake. The fire burned on, requiring nothing. The logs had been placed well, with enough space between them for air to circulate, allowing the fire to burn cleanly and steadily. The cedar smell was still present, though fainter now, having become so much a part of the room's atmosphere that it was barely noticeable, except when attention was drawn to it. The narrator paused in the writing for a moment, becoming aware of the scent again, appreciating it quietly before returning to the letter. The second letter came to its close, another gentle ending, another expression of warmth and connection. The pen lifted, and the letter was placed beside the first, left to dry in its own time. 2 letters now, 2 small bridges built across distance and time, connecting the writer to others who would receive them and read them, and perhaps feel a moment of quiet gladness at the gesture. A third sheet of parchment was drawn forward. The stack was still substantial, and there were more letters to write, more recipients to address. The narrator felt no fatigue, no sense of the task being burdensome. Instead, there was a kind of contentment in the repetition, in the steady progression from one letter to the next. Each one was slightly different, addressed to a different person, touching on different memories or observations, but they all shared the same essential quality, the same tone of gentle thoughtfulness, the same unhurried pace. The third letter began, and the pen moved once more across the page. This recipient was someone who lived far away, someone the narrator had not seen in a long time, though the connection between them remained strong despite the distance and the passage of years. The letter spoke of this distance without sadness, acknowledging it simply as a fact, one of the many circumstances that shape lives and relationships. The narrator wrote about the ways people stay connected even when separated by miles, the ways small gestures like letters can carry warmth and care across great expanses. The clock ticked on, marking minutes that accumulated into a quarter hour, then half an hour, though the exact measurement seemed unimportant. Time was passing, yes, but it was passing gently, without pressure. The night was long enough for all of this, for the writing of letters, for the quiet contemplation that accompanied the task. There was nowhere else to be, nothing else that needed doing. This was the activity of the evening, and it was enough. Outside, the wind stirred slightly, though it remained gentle, not strong enough to disturb the steady fall of snow or to rattle the windows. It was just a breath of movement in the cold air, a reminder that the world was still in motion, even in its stillness. The sound it made was soft, almost a sigh, and it passed quickly, leaving the night as quiet as before. The third letter filled its page, the narrator's hand moving with a practiced ease that came from years of writing, from a comfort with the act itself. The words were simple but carefully chosen, each one meant to convey exactly what was intended, no more and no less. There was no striving for eloquence, no attempt to impress or persuade. The letters were meant to be read easily, to communicate clearly, to bring a moment of connection and peace to whoever received them. As the third letter neared completion, the narrator became aware of the warmth of the room again, of the comfortable temperature that the fire and the closed doors and windows maintained. It was the kind of warmth that made the cold outside feel distant and irrelevant, that created this sense of shelter and security. The house was solid around this room, its walls thick, its foundation sure. It had stood through many winters, and it would stand through many more. providing this same refuge season after season. The third letter was finished and set aside with the others. Three now, three small accomplishments, three gestures of connection sent out into the wider world, or at least prepared to be sent. The letters would be folded eventually, placed in envelopes, addressed, stamped, and taken to be mailed. But that was a task for another time, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps the day after. For now they could simply rest on the desk, drying in the lamplight, complete in themselves. A fourth letter was begun, and then a fifth. The process had found its rhythm now, steady back and forth between thought and word, between intention and expression. Each letter was a small world unto itself, containing its own particular message, its own specific recipient, but they all emerged from the same quiet space, the same peaceful evening, the same gentle attention. The narrator wrote about different things in each letter, sometimes about the past, sometimes about the present, occasionally about hopes for the future, though always in a measured, undramatic way. One letter spoke of a garden that would be planted in spring, describing the vegetables that might be grown, the herbs that would be useful, the simple pleasure of working with soil and seeds. Another letter mentioned a book that had been read recently, a quiet story about ordinary people living ordinary lives, the kind of book that left a subtle impression rather than a dramatic one. The narrator wrote about these things without fanfare, treating them as the small, genuine parts of life that they were. The snow was deeper now on the windowsill, and the shapes of the trees outside were softer, their branches heavy with white. The night felt even more enclosed, even more separate from everything beyond this room, this house, this moment. It was a pleasant feeling, this sense of being contained and protected, of having a small, manageable space in which to exist for a while. The world was large and complicated, but here, in this room, things were simple and clear. More letters followed, each one taking its time, each one receiving the same careful attention as the ones before. The narrator's hand moved steadily across the pages, the fountain pen leaving its trail of ink, the words accumulating line by line. There was something meditative about the process, something that quieted the mind and focused the attention on the present moment. The concerns of the day, whatever they might have been, seemed to fall away, becoming less important, less pressing. What mattered was this, the simple act of writing, the connection with others that these letters represented. The fire had burned down further, the logs now mostly reduced to glowing embers, though they still gave off a steady heat. The orange light they cast was dimmer than before, and the room felt even more intimate, even more like a small pocket of warmth and light in the midst of the cold, dark winter. The narrator glanced toward the hearth, considering whether to add another log, but decided against it. The embers were enough, and the room was still comfortably warm. The fire would burn itself out eventually, but that was fine. By then, the letter writing would likely be done, and it would be time to think about rest. Letter after letter emerged from the pen, each one a small work of care and attention. Some were longer than others, some more detailed, but all carried the same essential quality of quiet thoughtfulness. The narrator wrote to family members, to old friends, to acquaintances who might be surprised to receive a letter, but who would, the narrator hoped, be pleased by it. In a time when communication had become so quick and so casual, there was something meaningful about taking the time to write by hand, to compose thoughts carefully, to send something tangible that could be held and kept. The clock continued its steady ticking, and the snow continued its steady falling, and the night continued its steady passage from evening toward the deep hours of darkness. Everything moved forward at its own pace, unhurried and certain. The narrator felt in rhythm with this pace, not fighting against time or trying to accomplish more than was comfortable, but simply moving along with the natural flow of the evening. Another letter was completed, and another, and the stack of finished letters on the desk grew while the stack of blank parchment diminished. The balance shifted slowly, predictably, from potential to accomplishment, from intention to completion. There was satisfaction in this, a quiet sense of progress that required no external validation, no praise or recognition. The letters were being written, and that was enough. The pen needed to be refilled at one point, and the narrator performed this small task with the same care as everything else. The bottle of ink was brought out from a drawer in the desk, its glass cool to the touch. The pen was unscrewed, the empty cartridge removed, the new one inserted and seated properly. A few drops of ink appeared on a cloth kept for this purpose, and then the pen was ready again, refilled and waiting. The interruption was brief, and the writing resumed almost immediately, the next letter beginning where the previous one had left off in the sequence. Some letters required more thought than others, and the narrator would pause occasionally, pen hovering above the page, considering what to say next or how to phrase a particular idea. These pauses were not uncomfortable or frustrating. They were simply part of the process, moments of reflection that helped shape the words that would eventually appear. When the right phrase came, the pen would descend again, and the writing would continue, as smooth and steady as before. The room around the narrator remained constant, a reliable backdrop to the activity of writing. The walls held their places, the furniture stood where it had always stood, the lamp continued to cast its circle of amber light. Nothing changed except the slow accumulation of words on paper, the gradual progress from one letter to the next. It was a small change, really barely noticeable moment to moment, but over the course of the evening it added up to something substantial, to a collection of messages ready to be sent out into the world. Outside, a small creature moved through the snow, perhaps a fox or a rabbit, leaving a trail of prints that would be covered by morning. The narrator caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the lamplight's reach, just a shadow passing across the white ground, and then it was gone. The night reclaimed its stillness, and the snow fell on undisturbed. It was a brief reminder that life continued even in the depths of winter, even in the coldest, quietest hours. More letters were written, and the pile on the desk continued to grow. The narrator's hand moved with the same steady rhythm, though perhaps a little more slowly now, not from fatigue, but from a kind of settling, a deepening into the quietness of the task. The letters that emerged in these later hours had a particularly peaceful quality, as though they had absorbed something of the night's deep tranquility, something of the snow's patient accumulation. One letter spoke of winter itself, of the way the season invited stillness and reflection, of the beauty in bare trees and white fields, of the comfort of warm rooms and quiet evenings. The narrator wrote about the appeal of this time of year, the way it seemed to slow everything down, to create space for activities like this, for the writing of letters by hand, for thoughts that moved at their own gentle pace. There was no rush to get through winter, no impatience for spring. Each season had its own character, its own particular gifts, and winter's gift was this stillness, this peace. Another letter mentioned the clock, its steady ticking a constant companion throughout the evening. The narrator had become so accustomed to the sound that it had almost disappeared, blending into the background of consciousness, but writing about it brought it back into awareness. The clock was old, inherited from family, and it had marked time in this house for longer than the narrator had lived here. It would continue to tick long after this night was over, long after these letters were sent and received, and perhaps forgotten. There was something comforting in that continuity, in the sense of being part of a longer story. The fire was low now, the embers glowing softly, but giving off less light than before. The room had dimmed slightly, though the lamp still provided enough illumination for writing. The change was subtle, a gradual shift that made the night feel even more advanced, even deeper. It was a kind of darkness that invited rest, that suggested the completion of the day's activities and the approach of sleep. But there were still a few more letters to write, and the narrator continued, working steadily through the remaining sheets of parchment. Each new letter required the same process, the same sequence of steps. The greeting, the opening thoughts, the main body of the message, the closing, the signature. The pattern had become familiar, almost ritualistic, and there was comfort in the repetition. The narrator knew what to do, knew how to shape each letter, knew how to find the words that would convey care and attention to each recipient. The task was well within capabilities, requiring no strain, no special effort beyond simple focus. The wind stirred again outside, a little stronger this time, but still gentle, and it brought with it a slight increase in the snowfall, the flakes coming down a bit more thickly for a few moments before returning to their earlier, leisurely pace. The narrator watched this through the window, appreciating the subtle variation in what had been a very steady pattern. The snow seemed inexhaustible, as though it might continue forever, but of course it would stop eventually. By morning, perhaps, or by afternoon. Whenever it stopped, it would leave the world transformed, clean and white and new. More letters emerged, each one a small act of connection, a reaching out across distance to touch someone else's life, however briefly. The narrator thought about the recipients as each letter was written, picturing them in their own homes, their own lives, imagining the moment when they would open the envelope and unfold the pages and see these words written in their name. Some would be surprised, some would be pleased, some would perhaps write back, continuing the exchange. Others might simply read and appreciate the gesture without responding, and that was fine too. The point was not to obligate or to expect anything in return, but simply to offer something to share a moment of thoughtfulness. The stack of completed letters was quite substantial now, a testament to the hours spent at the desk. The narrator had lost track of exactly how many had been written, but it didn't matter. The number wasn't important. What mattered was that each letter had been given the attention it deserved, that each recipient had been remembered and acknowledged. The task was nearing its end, with only a few sheets of parchment remaining in the original stack. The narrator's hand moved perhaps a bit more slowly now, the movement still fluid but more deliberate, as though the writing itself had absorbed the increasing quietness of the late hour. The letters that emerged now were particularly gentle, their words chosen with special care, their tone one of deep calm and contentment. They spoke of gratitude for connections maintained over time, of appreciation for the small kindnesses that people show each other, of hope for continued friendship and goodwill. One of the final letters was addressed to someone who had been kind during a difficult time, offering support without being asked, simply being present when presence was needed. The narrator wrote about this with simple directness, expressing thanks without elaborate elaboration, just a few sentences that acknowledged the value of what had been given. Sometimes the most important things could be said very simply, without need for flowery language or complex expression. The second to last letter was to someone the narrator had known since childhood, a friendship that had spanned decades, weathering all the changes and challenges that time brings. The letter spoke of shared memories, of moments from long ago that still held warmth and meaning, of the strange and wonderful way that certain connections persist despite all the forces that might pull people apart. It was a letter of affection and continuity, a reminder that some things endure. The final letter was perhaps the simplest of all, addressed to someone who lived nearby, someone the narrator saw regularly and spoke with often. It might have seemed unnecessary to write to someone so accessible, but the narrator felt the impulse to do so anyway, to mark this quiet winter night with one more gesture of connection. The letter was brief, just a few paragraphs noting the snow, the quietness of the evening, the pleasure of taking time to write. It ended with an invitation to visit soon, to share tea and conversation when the weather allowed. When the last letter was finished, the narrator set down the pen and looked at the collection on the desk. So many pages, so many words, all of them written by hand in the lamplight while the snow fell outside. It was done now, this task that had occupied the entire evening. The letters would need to be folded and placed in envelopes, addressed properly, stamped, and ready to mail. But that could wait until tomorrow. For now it was enough that they existed, that they had been written, that they lay here on the desk as evidence of time well spent. The clock ticked on, its rhythm unchanged, reliable as always. The fire had burned down to its final glow, just a few embers remaining, their light barely visible. The room was dimmer now, lit primarily by the lamp, which cast its circle of amber light over the desk and the letters and the chair where the narrator sat. Outside, the snow continued to fall, though perhaps a bit more lightly now. The accumulation on the windowsill grown to several inches, soft and undisturbed. The narrator remained seated for a while longer, not moving, simply existing in the quietness that had deepened throughout the evening. There was no need to rush to the next thing, no urgency to begin preparing for bed or to clean up the desk or to do anything at all. The night was still here, still holding its peace, and it seemed right to honor that by remaining still, by letting the silence settle more completely. After a time, the narrator reached forward and capped the fountain pen, the small click of the cap seating itself onto the pen barely audible. The pen was set down gently beside the completed letters. The bottle of ink was closed and returned to its drawer. These small actions were performed slowly, with the same care as everything else, each movement deliberate and complete. The letters lay on the desk, a small stack of cream-colored parchment covered in dark blue-black ink. Each one represented a connection, a reaching out, a small act of care taken in the middle of a long winter night. They would be sent in due time, would make their way to their various destinations, would be received and read and perhaps kept or perhaps not. All of that was beyond the narrator's control now. The work was done, the words were written, and what happened next would unfold in its own way. The snow outside was beautiful in the darkness, visible as a soft glow even without moonlight, the white of it reflecting back what little light existed in the night sky. The world looked peaceful and clean, the harsh edges of daylight soft by the covering of snow. The trees stood silent and patient. The path to the gate was smooth and untouched. The fields beyond were vast and still. It was a landscape that invited contemplation, that suggested rest and restoration. The narrator sat quietly in the chair, hands now resting in lap, no longer holding the pen, no longer engaged in any task. The evening had moved from purpose to completion, from activity to stillness. There was a satisfaction in this progression, a sense of having moved through something worthwhile and arrived at a natural conclusion. The letters had been written, the fire had burned low, the night had deepened, and now there was only the quiet, only the snow, only the steady ticking of the clock marking time that no longer felt like it needed to be marked. The lamp continued to burn steadily, its light unchanged, but the narrator's eyes were growing heavy now, the warmth of the room and the stillness of the hour combining to bring a gentle drowsiness. It was a pleasant sensation, this gradual slowing of thought and energy, this softening of the edges of consciousness. There was no resistance to it, no attempt to fight it off or to remain alert. Sleep would come when it came, and that was as it should be. The window showed the same scene it had shown all evening, the snow falling in the darkness, the world beyond quiet and white and still. It would continue to show this scene throughout the night, whether anyone was watching or not. The snow would keep falling until it stopped. The night would keep its vigil until dawn. The house would remain solid and warm around this room. All of these things would happen with or without attention, and that knowledge was somehow comforting, a reminder that the world continued on its path without requiring constant management or concern. The narrator's breathing had slowed, matching the pace of everything else in the room, the tick of the clock, the settling of the fire, the drift of the snow. Everything moved together in a kind of gentle harmony, nothing rushed, nothing delayed, everything in its proper time and place. The letters on the desk lay still, their words fixed now on the page, ready to carry their messages, but content to wait. The pen rested beside them, its work done for the evening, perhaps for several evenings to come. There was nothing more that needed doing, no task left incomplete, no obligation unfulfilled. The evening had been spent in quiet, purposeful activity, and now that activity had come to its natural close, the narrator could rise from the chair and move toward bed, could turn off the lamp and let the darkness fill the room, could leave the letters where they lay until morning brought new energy and new light. But for now there was this moment, this stillness, this peace. The snow fell softly outside the window, each flake finding its place among all the others, adding to the accumulation that would transform the familiar into something new by morning. The process was slow and steady, requiring nothing but time, and time was something the night had in abundance. There was no shortage of hours in which the snow could fall, no limit to the depth it might reach by dawn. It would be what it would be, and the morning would reveal whatever the night had created. The room held its warmth, held its peace, held the narrator in its quiet embrace. The walls were solid, the chair was comfortable, the desk was steady beneath the lamp. Everything was in its place. Everything was as it should be. The letters would be sent. The winter would continue. Spring would eventually come, and life would move through its seasons as it always had. But all of that was distant now, less important than this present moment, this quiet now. The narrator's eyes closed slowly, then opened again, then closed once more. The heaviness of sleep was approaching, gentle and inevitable, bringing with it the promise of rest and restoration. The night would hold everything safe while sleep came and while sleep held. The house would stand, the snow would fall, the clock would tick, and morning would arrive in its own time. There was nothing to worry about, nothing to fear, nothing to do but allow the natural progression of the evening to continue toward its peaceful conclusion. The lamp burned on, faithful in its task, casting its amber glow over the desk and the letters and the room beyond. Its light was steady and sure, requiring nothing, simply being what it was meant to be. The flame inside the lamp would burn until morning, unless someone chose to extinguish it earlier, but for now it remained, a small beacon of warmth and illumination in the deep hours of the night. The snow outside, the lamp inside, the clock on the wall, the letters on the desk, the fire reduced to embers, the narrator in the chair, all of these elements remained in their quiet arrangement, forming a scene of perfect stillness, perfect peace. Nothing moved except the slow, inevitable progression of time and the gentle falling of snow. Everything else was at rest, existing in a moment that seemed to stretch and soften, becoming less a specific point in time and more a general state of being. The night continued, as nights do, moving through its hours with patient inevitability. The letters lay waiting, the snow kept falling, and the quietness deepened into something that felt almost like silence. Though it was not quite silence, never quite silence, always carrying the faint sounds of the clock and the house and the winter world outside. But it was close enough to silence that the distinction hardly mattered. It was quiet, deeply and completely quiet, and that was enough. The narrator remained in the chair, breathing slowly, thinking of nothing in particular, simply being present in the room, in the night, in the moment. The letters were written. The task was complete. And now there was only this, only the gentle unwinding of the evening into rest, only the soft descent toward sleep. The world outside continued its quiet accumulation of snow, and the world inside held its warmth and peace. And between the two there was this small space, this room, this moment of stillness stretching on and on into the winter night. The weight of the evening settled over everything like another layer of snow, invisible but present, adding to the sense of enclosure and safety. The narrator's thoughts drifted without direction, touching lightly on the letters that had been written, on the people who would receive them, on the simple pleasure of having spent an evening in this way. There was no regret about the time taken, no feeling that it should have been spent differently or more productively. This had been exactly the right way to spend these hours, and the knowledge of that rightness brought its own quiet contentment. The lamp's flame wavered slightly, just the smallest movement, and then steadied again. It was a tiny disturbance, barely noticeable, but in the stillness of the room, even small things became visible. The narrator watched the light for a moment, seeing the way it played across the surface of the desk, creating small shadows where the letters lay stacked. The ink on the pages had long since dried, becoming permanent, fixed in place. The words would remain as they were written, unchanged by time or handling, until the paper itself deteriorated many years from now. Outside, the snow had created drifts in certain places, where the gentle wind had pushed it into small accumulations against the base of trees or along the side of the house. These drifts were smooth and rounded, shaped by air and gravity into forms that seemed almost purposeful in their design. The narrator could not see all of them from the window, but knew they were there, knew the patterns that winter created in this landscape, having witnessed them many times before. Each snowfall was unique in its details, but the general pattern was always familiar, always recognizable. The clock's ticking seemed to have slowed, though of course it had not. Time moved at its constant rate, unchanging and reliable. It was only the perception of it that shifted, the way awareness of time could expand or contract, depending on the state of mind, the level of attention. In moments of complete peace like this, time seemed to stretch and soften, each second becoming fuller, more spacious. The clock marked these seconds faithfully, but they felt longer than usual, as though there were more room inside them. The narrator's hands rested loosely in lap, no longer engaged in any task, no longer holding anything. They were simply hands at rest, positioned comfortably, requiring no thought or attention. The fingers were slightly curved, relaxed, and there was no tension anywhere in the arms or shoulders. The whole body had settled into a state of ease, aligned with the chair, supported by it, held safely in place. There was no discomfort, no need to shift or adjust. Everything was exactly as it should be. The fire's last embers glowed faintly in the hearth, giving off only the smallest amount of light now, barely visible from across the room. The heat they produced was minimal, but the room had retained its warmth from the earlier, stronger burning, and would remain comfortable for hours yet. The house itself held heat well, its thick walls and solid construction providing insulation against the cold night outside. This had always been a warm house, a place where winter could be faced without hardship, where the changing seasons brought variety without bringing suffering. A small sound came from somewhere in the house, perhaps a timber settling, perhaps the slight expansion or contraction of materials responding to temperature. It was a sound the narrator recognized, one of the many small noises that old houses make, each one familiar and unremarkable. The sound came and passed, leaving no echo, no aftermath. The house settled back into its silence, which was never quite silence, but rather a collection of small, steady sounds that together created something close to it. The narrator thought about the morning that would eventually come, about the way the light would change the appearance of everything, revealing the snow in full daylight, showing the depth of the accumulation, the transformation of the familiar landscape. The letters would still be here on the desk, waiting to be folded and addressed and prepared for my